Welcome to the Sargassum Champions Course. You are currently tuning into one of the videos produced for this course. Funding for the course comes from the Resilience, Sustainable Energy and Marine Biodiversity Program, RESENBID, financed under the 11th European Development Fund, EDF, Caribbean Overseas Countries and Territories Regional Program. RESENBID is being implemented by Expertise France, with the primary stakeholders being the 12 Caribbean overseas countries and territories. Let's get ready to learn together. Hello everybody. As part of the topic we are doing right now, sargassum removal, we have Jeanelle Irvine, and she's a master's graduate of the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies at the University of the West Indies in Barbados. She was responsible for producing the first coral report card for Barbados in 2020. She is also currently a research assistant with the SargAdapt project and has been largely responsible for maintaining the ever-expanding open-access collection of scientific papers on Sargassum, the Sargassum Reference Repository, as well as leading the creativity behind CERMES online Sargassum story maps and public educational materials. And one of these educational materials is Volume 5 of the SargAdapt Good Practice Guide series called Managing Sargassum Shoreline Inundations, a Toolbox. So I will give the word to Jeanelle, and you can start your presentation whenever you want.
So the presentation is Best Practices for Removing Sargassum Seaweed. As Evelyn said, I am Jeanelle Irvine, the research assistant with the SargAdapt project, but I'd also like to acknowledge that though I am the first author of this document, by no means have I written this by myself, so I want to acknowledge my brilliant co-authors who I couldn't have done this without, of course. Special thanks to Professor Oxenford, who was a great help in bringing it all together. So let's begin. So we know that the efforts to mitigate sargassum has often resulted in a lot of damage when people are trying to remove it because people are using methods that aren't exactly appropriate or using equipment that aren't suited for the purpose. And then when you make mistakes like this, it has high economic costs for labor, for equipment, and for transport. And so the Management Toolbox Guide recognizes the importance of learning from these mistakes and sharing the lessons learned so that the mistakes, of course, are not repeated again. So before we get into the different equipment types, we just want to point out a few key lessons that are important to keep in mind. There are 7 of them that we have outlined, and they are as follows. The first one has to do with applying adaptive management. So unplanned responses when reacting to sargassum inundation, of course, as you can imagine, waste resources, as I said before, you're repeating mistakes and harming those who are affected, especially people who live by the coast. So I have a diagram here that illustrates what adaptive management is all about. It's an ongoing cycle, and it starts out first with research and design. Then, of course, you implement the research, monitor and evaluate to see if the things that you've implemented are making sense and if they're actually useful. And then if they're not, you're learning to adjust, to adapt, and then you keep doing it all over and over and over again until you get it right. The second lesson is to know when to collect and when to leave it alone. Believe it or not, there are actually cases where leaving sargassum alone is actually a good idea. It's not always necessary to collect or clear up all the sargassum during all sargassum beaching events. So you see here I have a demonstration of what it looks like for a classification of low or medium or high sargassum inundation. You have to note that over sanitizing a beach, as they would say, is actually harmful to the environment. In the case of maybe medium amounts of sargassum, that might also require little to no intervention. And the sargassum is able to dry out naturally and then can be reincorporated back into the beach soil. However, in cases of really high inundations, large ones like the ones like the picture in the immediate on the immediate right, excuse me, where it's piled up meters high along the shoreline, obviously we have to remove that as quickly as possible. And so it has to be removed, as you can imagine, because there can be decomposition, which means that animals that live in the nearshore would be smothered. There would be an issue with the decomposition where toxic gases are released, like hydrogen sulfide or ammonia or methane. And when people are exposed to that, that can have health issues like eye irritation. And then something called the brown tide, which is when there's a plume of brown, poor quality water that's in the water. And that, apart from harming animals and plants in the water, it just downright, ruins the beach experience because everyone goes to the beach hoping to see a nice, pretty beach, right? Okay, a third lesson that we need to keep into mind is forecasting and monitoring the arrivals. So, important questions you often ask are when is it arriving, where is it arriving, and how much sargassum is arriving. So, in terms of forecasting, there are a few examples of sargassum products, forecasting products that are already available. The satellite-based Sargassum Watch System is one. CERMES, the department that I work for, produces a Sargassum Outlook Bulletin every 2 months for a 3-month period. And there are also several countries in the Caribbean that have their own forecast, places like Jamaica or Mexico or Guadeloupe. And then there are also other commercial forecasts that are available, for example, using something called the CLS SAM tool. As far as monitoring goes, monitoring, of course, is important because it would help us to validate the forecasts. So, as it stands, forecasting is to the best of our knowledge, but when you're able to monitor it on the ground, you are able to best we're able to improve those models that we currently used in forecasting, and they get better and better over time. So, of course, it's for validating, to inform the best methods you'd use for collection, and to understand how sargassum influxes vary over time. So we have two outputs that CERMES actually created, which can be used for easy sharing and comparison of data. One is called the Sargassum Monitoring Protocol Drones, and the other one is Beach. As the name suggests, the drones one incorporates drones, and then the beach one incorporates no drones, just the use of field material. And those are also parts of the Good Practice Guide series that the Management Toolbox is a part of. There's also a program called SargSnap that happens in West Africa, where there's cameras are used in terms of monitoring, and so the use of special cameras or webcams can also be very useful in monitoring projects also when it comes to sargassum. A fourth key lesson is knowing that and we have to emphasize this, there is no one size fits all solution when it comes to managing sargassum, whether it's you're collecting it in the water, or you're collecting it on shore. So the best practice requires solutions that are specific to every site, and every site is different, not just on a country scale, down to every shoreline of every country everywhere varies, and there are different things that need to be considered for best practice. So things like, in terms of physical considerations, things like what are the prevailing winds, what are the winds like, what's the depth of the water, what is the sea floor like, is coral there, is it rocky bottom, and that would affect things like if you want to have a mooring to put out a boom. Site access, of course. If you can't access the site, then how will you be able to clean it? Environmental considerations such as the shoreline vegetation that exists there, or mangroves there. As the picture to the left shows, is there some kind of dune vegetation? I believe that's a seaside morning glory. And also the presence, of course, of nearshore habitats, like is there seagrasses in the water, are there corals, things like that. And then what other wildlife are using the area, like birds that might be around. Of course, nesting sea turtles are something that really need to be considered. There are social economic implications, like what's the beach used for? Is the beach, maybe it's not used at all, or maybe it's a beach that's very heavily used for fishing, or it's a tourism beach. Also, things like the availability of funding, of course. If there's no money to buy specific equipment, that limits what you're able to access. And then there's logistical and legal implications like who owns the land? Do you need specific permits to go? Do you need specific permits to use certain kinds of equipment? Do you need specialized manpower? So these are all things that people who manage coastlines and want to clean it up have to consider. Then there's also the key lesson of choosing the right equipment, of course. And choosing it is very important, but has been really difficult for people because of, well, the lack of experience with dealing with sargassum, because it's still a fairly recent phenomenon. The first time sargassum arrived in the Caribbean was in 2011. So, although that's more than a decade ago, it's still not that much time. There's, of course, the need for specialized equipment, especially when you're dealing with in water collection. There's just a general scarcity of unbiased guidance for people to follow. And then, as I said before, in terms of costs, there's large costs often involved in buying or maintaining equipment, especially large volumes of equipment. So it's good that now that such errors can be avoided in the future through, as I said before, sharing experiences across the Caribbean so we can understand, all of us, what works and what doesn't. Another key lesson is designating suitable extraction and storage sites. So, okay, great, you've collected the sargassum. What are you going to do with it now? Is you going to, of course, are you going to store it temporarily on the shore for it to be disposed at another site later on? Or do you have maybe plans for it to be used for some kind of purpose, be it some people produce agricultural products like certain fertilizers or growth tonics for plants. I think in Mexico they have construction blocks. So whatever the industry is, those are things you have to consider also what state the sargassum has to be in when it is collected or to be collected. Site selection and preparation is important because sargassum has within it stored a lot of heavy metals. It's important to prepare the locations where it will be stored or disposed with lining it with geomembrane so that there isn't any kind of um, like downward movement of the chemicals into the groundwater, because then now you have a larger issue beyond sargassum. Then you have a freshwater issue, which of course could be a really big issue. So to prevent that, you'd be lining the areas with geomembranes. And then of course removal from the collection site. Of course, to remove it is a no-brainer. You need a suitable route to access the beach, transferring equipment. So whether it's a grab or a conveyor belt or, good old manpower to transfer it. And then, of course, some kind of equipment to transport it away. Most likely would be a dump truck of some sort. And so the storage or disposal it's very important that the disposal allows the sargassum to dry out, because we spoke about the issue of decomposing and the gases that it can produce and its implications for health and, of course, for safety, because these gases not only are toxic, but they are flammable. So those are things we have to keep in mind. And then the final key lesson is, of course, to communicate. So it's very important to keep policymakers, coastal stakeholders, visitors, and the wider public informed with relevant, up-to-date, and information that's easy to understand. So there's a tool called EpiCollect, for example, that is a citizen science project and allows regular people to go on and to add in instances of sargassum when they see it on the beach. And so, of course, picking the right communication method is critical so that the sargassum information reaches the intended audience. So I have a picture of a cell phone that's showing what the CERMES bulletin looks like, for example, the sargassum bulletin that we produce bi-monthly. But maybe that's not the most suitable for your audience. Possibly it would be like a sign on the beach, or radio or newspaper, or maybe text alerts or dedicated websites. There are lots of things to consider when it comes to communication. But above all, in order for most cleanup efforts to be successful, as you can imagine, for people to feel empowered, because knowledge is power, of course, that we have to communicate the information to them as soon as we get it. Okay, so we have all those things considered. We can jump into our toolbox where we'll be just demonstrating or illustrating the different methods for collection that are currently available based on observation by the authors, based on summary of documents that already exist, and things like that. So their collection of sargassum can be broken down into two types, as I said before. You can be collecting it on the shore or you can be collecting it on water. And each of these collection methods have different factors that determine their appropriateness. So for onshore collection, you have to consider things like the volume or the depth of the of the sargassum, presence of wildlife, the cost of manpower, and then of course access to the beach and sensitivity to erosion. Like if you can't access the beach, then I'm not sure how you'd be doing onshore collection. And then things like in water collection, obviously you have to consider the sea conditions, water depth, substrate type, the high cost of the equipment, as I said before, because this equipment costs a lot of money, especially well, there are expensive equipment, excuse me, for onshore, but inshore, in water equipment is particularly expensive. Distance from docking facilities. If the area in which the sargassum is going to be unloaded is far away, maybe in water collection doesn't make so much sense, possibly. And then, of course, the biodiversity that's associated with the sargassum. Like, do we have to be contending with large mammals like manatees or sharks or turtles and things like that? That's also an important thing to consider. So we'll jump into manual onshore collection. So we'll break it out into two types or methods, I guess you could say. There's a use of hand tools, and then there's the use of a beach sand. So the hand tools is the least environmentally damaging method. It doesn't compress the beach sand or damage turtle nesting sites or anything like that. It's least intrusive in terms of disturbing tourism and other beach users, as you can imagine when you're using a tractor or a crane or anything like that. Well, not quite a crane, a tractor or some kind of large heavy equipment that is a nuisance. It's an eyesore for people who would be also using the beach. Um, it's the most versatile as it regards to physical conditions. So regardless of the beach width or the slope or the sea conditions or site access or presence of infrastructure, like hand tools for manual onshore collection is your best bet. And of course, it's the least expensive. Everyone likes to save money because it uses relatively low cost equipment, like, a broom or a rake and a wheelbarrow. As you can kind of see in the image behind you, see some guys using some very low cost equipment. And then, of course, it's suitable for volunteer stakeholder involvement. That also is very important in terms of getting people involved and has the added benefit of offsetting labor costs. As it goes for beach sands, we generally don't recommend it because it is quite heavy when it's being used. It can easily damage the net and it's potentially harmful to the nearshore animals and plants. Um, Okay, mechanized onshore collection. That is perhaps the best or only option for moving quantities of sargassum that are really large when inundations are really high. It just doesn't make sense to use to try and manually collect all that sargassum. So of course, you'd be going in with your heavy equipment and getting the excess of the sargassum off first, leaving, getting the top layer off rather, and then another form of equipment or method can be used to remove the rest of it. But it can be potentially damaging to the beach, right? It can cause serious beach erosion, loss of strand vegetation, the compaction of the beach sand, and that has implications for destroying turtle nests and other habitats of animals who live in the area. It is, of course, the most intrusive. Like I said, a, a mechanical rake, as we'll describe later, versus a wheelbarrow definitely has a different effect for tourists when they see it. It's costly to purchase and maintain the equipment, especially because the equipment is operating in like a wet and salty environment. Um, there's obviously the need for dedicated access to the beach because it's big equipment. It needs to be able to get there somehow. And you need trained operators. So you can't involve the general public. There's, of course, that labor cost, and then the operation might require a permit, as it does in some jurisdictions. This is an example of some of the mechanical rates that are available for use commercially. And while it is appealing to use it because of its quickness, it should only be used after considering the local context. So we have a company called Barber that produces one, another one by Scarbat or Unicorn, and then Flozaga is another company that produces one. And then, of course, the other mechanized equipment, as we can recognize these, they're used for other purposes in construction or agriculture. But of course, things to note is to avoid using heavy tracked machinery on sandy beaches. And then, of course, the bucket types are also important because digging buckets can be particularly destructive. So using screening or claw buckets are often recommended. And as I said before, just to take the top layer of the sargassum off. And then, as I said before, it might require permits or guidelines to be used in specific jurisdictions. So we encourage, and I can't emphasize this enough, extreme caution when you're using this on the beach. Then we'll jump into in-water collection. So it's often agreed that where it's possible, in-water collection close to the shore is preferable to beach collection. And this approach can help avoid many of the negative impacts of sargassum and provide, quality sargassum, depending on what the use of the sargassum will be after it's collected. So there's a potential loss of biodiversity with the animals associated with the rafts. So as you can see from the picture, underneath the sargassum rafts, there are lots of animals, lots of different types of fish that live under the rafts. There are, juvenile turtles that might use the raft for shelter and things like that. But it is worth recognizing that based on research, that the composition of the animals who to the cling to the sargassum rafts, those are like crabs and certain other animals, it doesn't change with distance from the shore. So, or rather, distance from the shore up to about 1.5 kilometers or so. So, in terms of biodiversity loss, it's not, we don't have to worry about that so much. However, you should, of course, take special care if you're going to be using in water collection. As we said, when it comes to sea turtles and sea turtle hatchlings and things like that. So we have in-water collection can be broken down into two types. We have an offshore barrier and then we have a harvest boat. So the offshore barrier has to be purpose built. There were the initial use of like oil booms or silt barriers that are used in marine construction when sargassum started showing up, but that was proved to be ineffective. And so of course, there's been lots of research and design to produce a product that is specific for sargassum, and we're happy to now be in a place where there are lots of options that's concerned, that vary in construction, durability, and versatility. Um, so some suppliers either sell the barriers at standard lengths, or there are some providers who have custom built solutions where they'll install the mooring for you and provide maintenance. So that is also there are options in that way. And then there's a harvest boat, which also has to be purpose built. Um, Initially, fishing vessels or nets or other algae harvesters that are used for lakes were tried to be used in a sea context. As you can imagine, if you're using something that's designed for a lake in the sea, might not be that successful. So now we have, as I said before, refined design where there is equipment that is specialized for this sort of thing. And a harvest boat is most effective when used alongside an offshore barrier so that the barrier is aggregating the sargassum, as you can see in the picture behind us, where there's a barrier ahead that's aggregated the sargassum, and then the boat comes in and slowly moves along and removes the sargassum. So there are different choices of nearshore barriers. There are different companies: Algae Nova, Desmi, Okeanis, Elastic. And so they all vary slightly, but they all perform the same thing. But they're important design features to keep in mind. They all more or less have a above surface fence so that there's no overtopping. Things like multiple detachable segments are often very useful so that you can deploy it easily and take it out when you need to, that kind of thing. There's a net underneath the water so that the water, of course, can flow underneath and there's no entrapment of animals that might be passing through. And then, of course, you need multiple anchors because this thing is contending with the weight of and the wave action and that sort of thing. So you need multiple anchors to keep a thing like a barrier in place. And then there are different choices of harvest boats. And these are, of course, highly stable. They need to have a harvest capacity to meet the volumes of sargassum that you're trying to get. It doesn't make sense. It's not sensible to get a very small boat if you're contending with certain volumes of sargassum. The use of adequate power to have the boat move along. So using paddle propulsion is generally not a good idea. Something with an engine that can move is more or less your best bet. When it comes to removal and transport, there's a lot of choice of equipment. As you can see, you can be using a pitchfork and a small trailer, or a backhoe and a large truck, or a caterpillar excavator. Even cane grabs have been used and have been found to be very effective. And, also things like conveyors to be moving the material from the boats to trucks on land and things like that. And so, a few good practices when it comes to removing and transporting sargassum is having a dedicated access route. So, you're minimizing the damage to the beach, which is obviously a good idea. Closing areas of the beach to the public while you're operating the heavy machinery for everyone's safety. If it has to be collected, as we've said before, you dry and separate it, and trying your best never to operate heavy equipment over turtle nesting areas. So it's always a good idea to have somebody on the team when these removal exercises are taking place. Excuse me, who are monitoring and looking out for wildlife to prevent accidents when it comes to animals that live in the area and endangered species and things like that. At the end of the toolbox, we do have a matrix as adapted from Shiro et al. That helps you in choosing the most appropriate method or equipment based on various conditions. Um, and so we have the red X's, and then we have a green area. And so while we're not trying to be prescriptive, we just think that this is also a good idea to consider and to when you're thinking about the different conditions that exist in the shoreline that you're trying to clean. It helps you in choosing the most appropriate method. So I hope that this has been very helpful to you. This has been a crash course on removing sargassum. If you want a more in-depth understanding or overview of what we've produced, feel free to browse the document that we've poured ourselves into. We hope you find it very useful, and thank you so very much.
Was a great presentation, Jeanelle.
Thank you so much.
Yes, very, very understood. Everything was very well understood, and we thank you so much for having the time to share with us your your book and your findings.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciated it. It was a good time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you everybody for hearing us again, and we will be back with a new video soon.
Thank you for tuning in today and learning with us from experts in the sargassum field. This course is made possible through funding by the Resilience, Sustainable Energy and Marine Biodiversity Program, RESNBID, financed under the 11th European Development Fund, EDF, Caribbean Overseas Countries and Territories Regional Program. ResinBid is being implemented by Expertise France, with the primary stakeholders being the 12 Caribbean overseas countries and territories. The course was designed by Franziska Elmer and Evelyn Salas, and the videos were produced by Marcel van der Kamp.